In the year 301 AD, the Roman Empire faced a crisis we would recognize instantly. Prices were soaring, the currency was broken, and public fury was rising. Emperor Diocletian's solution was not to repair the economy, but to outlaw its fundamental mechanics. His edict on maximum prices stands as a 1,700-year-old monument to policy failure. In its core, authoritarian logic is being quietly drafted into legislative proposals in Washington today. The edict's specifics are shockingly precise. It commanded, for example, that a modius, roughly a peck of wheat, could not be sold for more than 100 denarii, while a soldier's daily wage was capped at 25 denarii. But this was a lethal fiction. The denarius coin, through decades of state-mandated debasement, had lost over 90% of its silver content. The law didn't address the root cause, a worthless currency. It simply demanded that reality conform to the state's broken accounting. We dismissed price controls as a relic of the 1970s, but Diocletian's edict was vastly more comprehensive, attempting to freeze the cost of over 1,000 goods, services, and wages across an empire. Its failure was total. Goods disappeared from official markets. A vast black market exploded, and within a few years, the law was universally ignored. Yet, when persistent, complex inflation erodes political legitimacy, the appeal of a simple draconian solution becomes timeless. This raises the pivotal question: why would any modern government consider reviving a policy that failed catastrophically in 301 AD? The answer lies not in economic science, but in the unchanging political mathematics of desperation, a formula that is recalculating itself right now. To understand the policy horizon of 2026, we must first understand the mechanics of 301 AD. And that story begins not with the control of prices, but with the systematic destruction of money itself. The inflation that crippled Rome had a clear, singular root: the systematic debasement of its currency. To finance endless civil wars, barbarian invasions, and a collapsing tax base, successive emperors reduced the silver content in the denarius from nearly pure in the 1st century to less than 5% by 274 AD. This was monetary inflation in its most literal form, creating more coinage with less intrinsic value, chasing a diminishing supply of goods as trade routes and agricultural production faltered. The contemporary historian Lactantius witnessed the aftermath, writing in De Mortibus Persecutorum, "There was enacted a law for the control of prices. Then much blood was shed for small and cheap items. The people brought nothing to market because of the high prices, and scarcity grew much worse." His account confirms the edict's immediate failure: violence, scarcity, and a paralyzed economy. Critically, the Roman state catastrophically misdiagnosed the problem. Officials blamed greedy merchants and hoarders, the ancient perfect analog to modern political narratives of greedflation and corporate price gouging. They attacked the symptom, high nominal prices, while ignoring the disease, a currency that had been rendered worthless by state policy. The modern parallel is not in coinage, but in fiscal debasement. Since 2020, the United States has not clipped silver from dollars. Instead, it has engaged in massive deficit spending and central bank balance sheet expansion, creating trillions of new digital dollars. The M2 money supply grew over 40% from 2020 to 2022. While the mechanism is different, digital ledger entries versus metal shavings, the potential economic effect when this new money collides with supply constraints, as seen post-COVID, shares a kinship with Rome's experience. Too much money chasing too few goods, eroding purchasing power. The documented modern view of inflation as a complex, multifactorial problem stands in contrast to this verified historical example, where a primary monetary cause was willfully ignored by authorities in favor of blaming the market's participants. Faced with a furious populace and a root cause they refused to acknowledge, Diocletian's government ultimately reached for the most powerful and most destructive tool at its disposal, the imperial decree to command reality. Diocletian's edict was not a simple cap on bread and wine. It was a breathtakingly comprehensive attempt to centrally plan a continent-wide economy through stone and law. Its scope was staggering, setting maximum prices for over 1,200 specific items and services, from British wool and Egyptian linen to Gallic ham, Spanish saltfish, a haircut in Rome, a teacher's salary in Athens, and the wages of a sewer cleaner. It was a complete, codified fantasy of state-controlled costs. Its enforcement was draconian and designed to terrorize. The penalty for selling a good above the decreed price was death. The penalty for buying above the price was also death. The edict explicitly encouraged citizens to inform on one another, transforming everyday commerce and neighborly interaction into potential capital crimes. It weaponized the population against itself. The edict's fatal flaw was its economic illiteracy, which it elevated to state doctrine. It fixed nominal prices in a currency undergoing hyperinflation. It did absolutely nothing to address the root causes. it did not plant more wheat, repair crumbling roads to bring goods to market, or restore silver to the debased denarius. As historian Peter Temmin concluded, it was an act of desperation, a theatrical display of state power that brutally ignored economic reality, reflecting the government's fundamental inability to solve the underlying fiscal and monetary crisis. This stands in stark contrast to the documented perception of ancient Rome as a primitive empire. The verified reality reveals a sophisticated, terrifyingly modern attempt at total economic control through legal coercion and surveillance. The results of imposing such a system on a complex economy were instant, predictable, and catastrophic. They provide a perfect 1,700-year-old case study for what will unfold in 2026 if the same political logic of commanding prices, rather than fixing fundamental causes, prevails once more. The consequences of Diocletian's edict were immediate, severe, and unfolded with the grim predictability of economic law. 1. Goods vanished from official markets. Faced with selling wheat or cloth at a state-mandated ruinous loss, farmers and merchants simply stopped bringing goods to the official forum. Why produce for a guaranteed loss? The stores of the Annona, state grain supply, emptied. As Lactantius recorded, scarcity grew much worse as the edict itself annihilated the incentive to produce and sell. 2. The black market exploded. Commerce did not cease. It was criminalized. A vast, illegal network arose where prices were not only higher than the edict's caps, but soared far above pre-edict levels. Sellers now demanded a massive risk premium for defying a death sentence. This created a two-tier society: the well-connected or criminal who could access the black market, and the law-abiding citizen left to starve. 3. Specialization and trade seized up. The complex Roman economy relied on long-distance trade. A shipowner would not risk a voyage from Alexandria to Rome carrying linen if the capped sale price couldn't cover his costs, let alone profit. Regional self-sufficiency collapsed and intricate supply chains frayed, intensifying localized shortages of everything from Spanish oil to Gallic metalwork. 4. The state's response: doubling down with force. Diocletian didn't repeal the law, he amplified control. He issued laws tying farmers to their land and forcing sons to inherit their fathers' occupations, attempting to freeze the economy in place to fit the artificial price structure. This move toward a rigid, state-directed system strangled economic adaptation and innovation, planting the seeds of medieval serfdom. The final outcome was abject failure. Within a few years, the law was universally ignored and unenforceable, though it technically remained. The underlying hyperinflation from a worthless currency continued unabated until Constantine finally replaced the entire monetary system decades later. The edict didn't single-handedly cause the empire's fall, but it dramatically accelerated its economic fragmentation and social bitterness. It proved that when the state declares war on supply, demand, and human incentive, it always loses, imposing immense suffering in the process. Fast forward 1,723 years. The immutable laws of economics are unchanged. The political pressures of inflation and public anger are identical. And in legislative chambers today, the first drafts of a modern edict are being quietly written. The path to a modern price edict is not a sudden leap, but a predictable creep driven by a pressure cooker of economic stagnation and political fury. The scenario: sticky inflation settles in. Assume consumer price index, CPI. Inflation refuses to return to the Fed's 2% target, instead plateauing in the 3 and 4% range through 2025. The Federal Reserve, acutely aware that raising rates further could detonate the commercial real estate market or trigger a sovereign debt crisis, hesitates. The public narrative solidifies. Inflation is now a permanent, insidious tax. The political tipping point, 2026 election cycle. With real wages still eroded, the cost of living becomes the singular explosive issue of the midterm elections. Populist candidates from both the left and right, mirroring Diocletian's ancient blame of profiteers, champion emergency legislation. Bills like the Corporate Price Gouging Prevention Act gain traction, proposing de facto price caps on essentials, food staples, energy, pharmaceuticals, and rent. To preempt accusations of sparking a wage price spiral, proposals for parallel wage controls or guidelines enter the discourse. The crisis justification. A sharp spike in oil prices due to a geopolitical flare-up or a domestic agricultural disaster provides the necessary emergency pretext. Legislation initially framed as narrow and targeted is rapidly amended in committee to broaden its scope. The political logic becomes irresistible. We must do something decisive. This is something we can pass. Loss of central bank credibility. If the Federal Reserve is widely perceived as having lost control of inflation, demands for direct legislative action from Congress escalate. Authority over prices subtly shifts from the technocratic, independent central bank to political bodies, seeking a visible, forceful response. exactly as control shifted from market forces to the imperial court in 301 AD. The documented consensus among economists that price controls are unthinkable crumbles against the verified historical pattern where they become politically inevitable under sustained inflationary pressure, exemplified by President Nixon's shocking imposition of wage and price controls in 1971. The modern edict won't be inscribed on stone pillars. It will be buried within a 2,000-page omnibus spending bill, but its economic effects, dictated by laws unchanged since Diocletian, will be just as predictable and severe. The modern edict will not begin with 1 to 100 items. It will debut as a targeted emergency measure. The most politically likely first targets are 1. Pharmaceuticals, e.g. insulin, inhalers. 2. Grocery staples during declared supply chain emergencies. 3. Federalized rent control mandates for major cities. And 4. Windfall profit taxes on energy companies that functionally act as price caps. The economic distortions will be immediate and severe in each case. Take the grocery example. A law caps the profit margin on beef. Retailers and processors, still facing uncapped and rising costs for labor, transportation, packaging, and energy, face a simple choice: sell at a loss or adapt. They will adapt by discontinuing loss-making, lower margin cuts, focusing only on premium, uncapped products, or withdrawing from the beef category altogether. The promised affordable option vanishes, harming the very low-income families the policy purported to help. The supply chain amplification will be catastrophic. The 21st century supply chain is a web of global interdependency. Fixing the final price of an automobile or even a key component like a semiconductor without controlling the prices of its thousands of subcomponents, raw materials, and logistical services makes production financially impossible. Cascading shortages and production halts would ripple outward, dwarfing the COVID-era disruptions. The edict's ancient ignorance of interconnectedness would be supercharged by modern complexity. It will be a profound innovation killer. A biotech firm facing a price cap on a successful cancer drug will inevitably slash its research and development budget for future cures. The calculation shifts from high-risk, high-reward breakthroughs to safe, incremental updates. Where Diocletian's laws froze occupations, a modern edict would freeze technological progress in the very sectors deemed most critical. Finally, a regulatory black market will emerge. This isn't trading in alleyways, it's sophisticated regulatory arbitrage. Companies will rebrand products into new premium categories, shift revenues to uncapped business-to-business services, or create complex transfer pricing schemes with international subsidiaries. A shadow economy of compliance avoidance manned by lawyers and accountants will bloom overnight. The contrast between the documented political promise of punishing corporate giants and helping working families and the verified economic outcome of reduced supply, stifled innovation, and hidden cost increases will become painfully clear within months. As these selective controls fail to reduce aggregate inflation while causing visible shortages and job losses in affected sectors, the political demand will intensify. The half measures failed. We need real courage and comprehensive action. This public and political frustration triggers the inevitable dangerous expansion into Phase 2. As the targeted controls of 2026 manifest in shortages and sectoral chaos, the political response will be to expand, not retreat. The escalation logic is perverse. With corporate profiteering supposedly curbed, yet prices still rising, the narrative pivots to blame runaway wages. Major union contracts are singled out. A call for shared sacrifice legitimizes a wage freeze for public sector and large unionized private sector jobs. This triggers a stagflation death spiral. Frozen wages destroy consumer purchasing power, pushing the economy toward recession. But the government, now having claimed ownership of the price level, cannot tolerate the resulting unemployment. It responds with massive stimulus checks and subsidies, more fiscal debasement to prop up demand. This pours fuel on the underlying monetary inflation that the controls are trying to hide, creating the worst of both worlds. A stagnant economy with suppressed but accelerating inflation, exactly the trap of the 1970s, now on digital steroids. A bureaucratic nightmare is born. A new Price and Wage Stability Board is established, instantly drowning in millions of exemption requests, lobbying from every industry, and the philosophically impossible task of setting fair prices for countless goods and services. Corruption and regulatory capture become endemic as businesses vie for favorable rulings, and the agency's decisions arbitrarily create winners and losers. This leads to the final chilling parallel with Rome. Having assumed responsibility for prices, the state must now control production to ensure supply matches its artificial price points. Subsidies for favored industries, production quotas, and mandates follow. The economy doesn't shift to a state-directed system by socialist ideology, but by the failed incremental logic of the initial price decree, a slippery slope from market correction to central planning. The documented political vision of a fair and stabilized economy dissolves into the verified historical reality of bureaucratic stagnation, hidden scarcity, and a slow leakage of economic vitality. The endgame is not a dramatic overnight collapse. It is a long, grinding decline in living standards and dynamism, as the energy of voluntary exchange is sapped by 1,000 bureaucratic dictates. This is the true, enduring lesson of 301 AD. The wreckage of Diocletian's edict and every failed control since reveals 4 immutable economic laws as fixed as the laws of physics. Law 1. Controls attack. Symptoms, not causes. High prices are a signal of an underlying problem. Too much money chasing too few goods, or a breakdown in supply. Price controls are an attempt to shoot the messenger. They silence the signal while the root cause, whether a debased currency, a supply shock, or fiscal profligacy, continues unchecked, guaranteeing the problem worsens. Law 2. They create shortages. By legally setting a price below the market clearing equilibrium, the price where supply meets demand, they guarantee that quantity demanded will exceed quantity supplied. This is not a possibility, it is a mathematical certainty. The result is empty shelves, rationing, and queues, as seen in Rome in 301 AD and in U.S. gas lines in 1973. Law 3. They divert activity, not eliminate it. Human ingenuity and the desire to trade cannot be legislated away. Commerce does not vanish. It is diverted into 3 channels: a black market with higher prices and no quality control, a shift of resources into uncapped or less regulated sectors, creating new imbalances, and a surge in corruption and lobbying to gain exemptions or favorable rulings from the controlling bureaucracy. Law 4. They reduce quality and innovation. When revenue per unit is capped, the only path to maintaining profitability is to cut costs. This leads to degraded quality, shoddier materials, and reduced service. Furthermore, the prospect of capped future returns destroys the incentive to invest in research and development. Why invent a better product if you cannot price it to recoup the investment? As economist Thomas Sowell succinctly put it, price controls have all the eloquence of a visible fist, but none of the suasion of an invisible hand. These 4 laws held true under the Mediterranean sun in 301 AD and under the fluorescent lights of Washington in 1971. They will hold true with absolute certainty in 2026. The only remaining question is whether we, armed with 1,700 years of evidence, will choose to remember them before it is too late. The most recent Western rehearsal for Diocletian's failure was President Richard Nixon's 1971 wage price freeze. Facing rising inflation and a run on the gold-backed dollar, Nixon imposed a 90-day freeze, followed by a complex, multi-phase system of controls. Initially popular, it quickly produced distortions like the infamous beef shortage and did nothing to cure the underlying monetary inflation. When controls were finally lifted in 1974, the pent-up price pressure exploded, contributing to the decade's devastating stagflation. The critical difference between 1971 and 2026 is the perceived problem. Nixon's controls were a temporary political gambit during a crisis of the gold standard. The pressure for controls in 2026 would stem from a perceived permanent loss of central bank credibility and control over inflation, making them far more likely to be entrenched, expanded, and defended as a permanent feature, just as Diocletian's edict was never formally repealed, only ignored. For a live-action replay, observe Argentina and Venezuela. Argentina's Precios Cuidados, careful prices, program in Venezuela's comprehensive price boards have created textbook outcomes. Empty official shelves, a booming black market where goods are available at multiples of the official price, and the utter collapse of domestic production. These are not ancient histories, they are current events, providing a real-time window into the economic disintegration that follows when the state wages war on prices. Furthermore, a 2026 control regime would have a tool Diocletian lacked: digital enforcement. With the infrastructure of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, and pervasive digital payment tracking, authorities could theoretically monitor transactions in real time, making evasion through the traditional black market vastly harder. However, this doesn't fix the economics. It amplifies the control's suffocating effect, strangling legal commerce entirely while potentially driving activity into untraceable cryptocurrencies or barter. The documented, comfortable dismissal of price controls as a solved debate among economists is dangerously naive. Verified history shows they recur with predictable regularity whenever the specific conditions of persistent inflation, political desperation, and a willingness to blame market participants align. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The rhyme scheme for price controls is a dirge. For investors, workers, and citizens, the coming debate is not an academic exercise. It is a direct threat to the most vital mechanism for economic coordination and prosperity we have, the free and voluntary price system. Diocletian's edict was not merely bad economics, it was a war on information. The price signal, the miraculous system that tells producers what to make more of and consumers what to use less of, was outlawed. The result was darkness, scarcity, and chaos. The same declaration of war on economic reality is being drafted today. The actual Roman solution that worked came from Emperor Constantine. Decades after the edict's failure, he halted the hyperinflation not by controlling prices, but by introducing a new, stable gold coin, the solidus. He fixed the money, not the prices. The modern equivalent is the politically arduous work of restoring monetary and fiscal discipline, the very task that price controls are designed to help politicians avoid. For citizens and investors, defense requires recognize the pattern. When you hear price gouging laws with criminal penalties, see Diocletian's death sentence. Follow the incentives. Ask, what vital activity does this make illegal? Where will it go? The answer is always shortages and black markets. Prepare for distortions. If controls emerge, expect scarcity in targeted sectors. Favor investments in tangible assets, productive capacity, and sectors less vulnerable to simplistic political fixes. Advocate for the true fix, support policies that increase supply through deregulation and open trade, and restore sound money through fiscal responsibility, however politically challenging. The ultimate cost is social. As Lactantius recorded, after the edict, fear universally possessed the people. Price controls transform commerce from peaceful cooperation into a potential crime, and neighbors into informants or outlaws. When the 2026 bill is introduced, don't just read the press release praising its toughness on greed. Read its list of controlled prices. Then go read Diocletian's list. The distance between them is 1,700 years of lessons we are poised to forget. The price signal is civilization's most vital nervous system. In 301 AD, Rome chose to sever it. We will face the same catastrophic choice in 2026.